So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about Chapter 2 of Reconstruction in Philosophy by John Dewey. This chapter is entitled Some Historical Factors, and he's going to look at some historical factors related to the kind of philosophical reconstruction that the book is attempting to argue for. So, the first historical factor he wants to point at comes from Francis Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1626. And Bacon was famous for saying, knowledge is power. And Dewey calls him a real founder of modern thought, and he calls him the prophet of a pragmatic conception of knowledge. Why does he say this? Well, because Bacon argues that knowledge can't be copied, it cannot be taken from tradition or held on faith, faith which systematized mistakes, faith which systematized prejudices, and then indoctrinated them. Bacon thought that this was not the route to knowledge. He thought that instinctive reactions that people have can't be held as true. And this is something which he saw in the history of science, history of philosophy. People who followed superficial analogies, people who jumped to conclusions, people who didn't pay attention to details or overlooked them, overlooked exceptions to rules, and so forth. For Bacon, knowledge has to use observation, it has to attend to the present conditions, it has to attend to the aims, the future aims. In order to be a discovery of new facts, knowledge cannot just be a demonstration of old principles. So, for Bacon, principles and laws are not obvious. You can't read them off of the state of things. They have to be wrested, right? Taken from nature with experiment. So you could think of the bee as a good metaphor, right? The bee who is flying around, gathering up honey, pollen, right? Gathering up pollen, I guess, and then doing something with it, making honey, doing something with what's gathered. Knowledge is not a solitary contemplative affair. It is a social, collaborative form of inquiry. Right? So for Bacon, and this is what Dewey admires in him, older truths have to be regularly criticized. They have to be tested by experience, tested in experience, tested for their potential use value, and retained or discarded on the basis of their potential for that future use. Now, a second historical factor that Dewey points at in this chapter come back to social or societal causes behind what amounted to an intellectual revolution. He looks at these factors and he sees a combination of new mental attitudes that Bacon discusses, along with other factors, things like travel, exploration, commerce. All of these things had effects. Adventure leads to changes in attitude, right? Because you go somewhere else and you become aware of different ways of thinking. In fact, you even get used to traveling, going on adventures. You get used to seeing that your ideas could change. And so, in this way, too, traditional beliefs are loosened. They give way to new methods and new inventions. So there's an overall effect which happens. There's a widespread expectation that develops that science is not just about revealing nature, right? As if nature is out there solid and complete and you just reveal it. Rather, science becomes something more like controlling energies. Right? Now, in addition, the way knowledge is conceived is also shifted by other factors such as the rise of the modern state, the rise of contract theory. These were things which expressed the notion that the source of the state's purpose was something which had to be understood. There was a kind of constructibility to the state, which hadn't really been understood before because it had been taken for granted. It had been accepted by tradition. The rise of Protestantism was also a factor. The increased focus in Protestantism of the individual's conscience, of rights and freedoms. There were other changes too, material changes, economic changes, improvements in technology, creation of new appliances, creation of new tools, changes in the kinds of resources that were available, even the extension of economic markets. All right, the rise of capitalism is happening, rapid transit. So all of these things combine to foment further change in outlook and attitude about what knowledge is and what it could do. So to sort of come to the gist here, or to give a little bit of a summary here, you have the rise of widespread intellectual interest, which shifts from an interest in the eternal or universal aspects of the world to what is changing, what's happening over here, what's happening over there, the specifics of things. There's a gradual decay in the authority of old institutions, the authority of old class distinctions. There's an attenuation or diminution of the ability to command people because they just don't believe in the class structure as much as they did before. So there are new problems of obedience for people who are in charge. There's a rise of interest in the power of the individual mind to observe and to reflect and to experiment. There's a rise in the role played by the intellectual virtues, by the ability to observe, to analyze, to summarize, to generalize, to do all of these things that we typically do now in critical thinking classes. So this comes about in part because of the emphasis placed on individual conscience. Have an emphasis on, well, what are the virtues of the mind? How does the mind acquire knowledge? What are the good aspects of the mind for that? There's also an increased tendency that sort of principles and alleged truths are going to now be judged by a different criteria, by a criteria of where do they come from in experience? How do you know, How do you know these things? Where in experience does that idea, that principle come from? What happens if we believe it? What are the consequences in experience? So, in effect, this is why people are increasingly demanding a turn to experience. Now, one final thing to point out is that this is around the time that there's an ideological rise of the idea of progress. There's a belief in progress. And so there's a future-looking, prospective attitude, and there's a form of criteria in experience and future experience that together contribute to a rise in scientific thinking and discovery and technological discovery, but also the idea that progress is cumulative and it's continuing to happen, and it's even something to be for. Okay? So there's a larger theme that Dewey's emphasizing in these historical examples, and namely, it's this. He's driving at the idea that science and industry, science and technology have been working and stimulating each other for a long time. And they've been directing each other's progress for a long time, Scientific discoveries have led to the need for new tools to keep going with those discoveries. And sometimes a technological discovery will lead to the discovery of new phenomena that then need scientific explanations. So there's this back and forth play between science and technology, and it's resulted in enormous advances in chemistry, in physics, in biology, and of course in technology. Dewey is saying that these advances have not really been applied fully to social problems, to moral problems. And so the job of philosophical reconstruction, as he sees it in this book, is to take the lessons that have paid off so well in the physical and social sciences, physical sciences mostly, and apply them to help predict, control, and solve social and moral problems, including economic problems. So one final thought here, and that is that he mentions, which is what's the role of idealism in this sort of historical progression? And here Dewey suggests that idealism, the period following sort of the early empiricists, idealism comes about as a kind of transition between what's going on in early modern's hard materialist break with the authority of religion, the authority of the past, and it is not, though, a final answer to where thought is going. And thought is going, I mean, and has gone in a lot of ways, into a period which is much more instrumental, much more pragmatic, much more experimental, and much more open-ended. It's not trying to construct vast metaphysical systems, and that's where Dewey thinks the sort of the trajectory of historical thinking is going. And so idealism is a transitional moment in that. So this ends the lecture, the short lecture here on chapter 2, and it will lead into the next chapters of Reconstruction in philosophy, and I hope this has been helpful for you.